The widow who refused to disappear. When six orphaned girls placed a half-eaten biscuit into the hands of the town's most hated widow, no one imagined it would spark a war. Mara Quinn had already buried two husbands and lost everything, except the one thing Dry Ridge, Wyoming couldn't stomach, her refusal to vanish. The summer of 1876 turned brutal when those children decided that a woman the world had thrown away was exactly the mother they needed. But the law, the church, and every respectable citizen had other plans. This is the story of how a homeless woman and six forgotten girls built a family under a sun so merciless it could kill, and how love became the most dangerous rebellion of all. If you're watching from your city tonight, drop a comment below and let me know where this story is reaching. I want to see how far Mara and her girls can travel. The heat in Dry Ridge didn't just beat down, it punished. It turned the wooden boardwalks into something that groaned underfoot, baked the wagon ruts into clay ridges hard enough to snap an ankle, and made the air itself feel like breathing through wet wool. By mid-July, the town had gone quiet in that specific way frontier settlements do when the sun becomes an enemy. Shops closed their shutters at noon. Horses stood motionless in whatever shade they could find, tails flicking at flies with the mechanical rhythm of the defeated. Even the dogs had stopped barking. Mara Quinn sat on a warped bench outside Hutchins Mercantile, shuttered now for 3 weeks since old Hutchins died and his daughter moved east, and felt the heat press against her like a hand she couldn't shake off. Her morning dress, maroon wool that had been fine once, clung to her back in damp patches. She'd cinched it with a length of twine because she'd lost weight, lost appetite, lost the ability to care about things like tailoring or propriety. The dress hung on her frame the way grief does, visible, ill-fitting, impossible to remove. She wasn't supposed to be here. That much was clear from the way people crossed the street when they saw her, the way conversations died when she came too close, the way the baker's wife had told her outright last week that your kind of trouble wasn't welcome near the bread. Mara had stopped arguing. She'd buried 2 husbands in 4 years, Samuel to a mining accident, then Jacob to fever, and Dry Ridge had decided that made her cursed. Bad luck in a dress. A woman who survived when good men didn't, which meant she must have done something to tip the scales. They didn't say it with words, mostly. They said it with silence, with turned shoulders, with the way work dried up, and invitations stopped, and doors that used to open simply didn't anymore. She had $10 left. No family, no prospects, and a town that had already written her name in its ledger under problem. The sun climbed higher. Mara closed her eyes and let the brightness burn through her eyelids, painting the world red and orange behind the thin skin. Cicadas screamed from the cottonwoods down by the creek. Somewhere a shutter banged loose in the wind, a rhythmic percussion that made the silence worse. She was waiting, though she couldn't have said for what. For the day to end. For the heat to kill her, or the hunger to finish what grief had started. For someone to finally tell her to leave so she'd have a direction to walk. That's when she heard them. Footsteps. Small ones. 6 pairs crunching through the sun-baked grit and dust that covered Main Street like a shroud. Mara opened her eyes. 6 girls stood in a crooked line 10 feet away, staring at her with the kind of intensity that made her spine straighten. They ranged in age from maybe 10 down to 3, dressed in clothes that had been mended so many times the original fabric was hard to identify. Shawls made from old curtains, skirts cut from flour sacks, boots that didn't match. One girl wore a man's work boot on her left foot and a child's button-up shoe on her right, the leather cracked and splitting at the seams. Their hair had been braided, but with scraps of string instead of ribbon, and the braids were coming loose in the heat. The smallest one clutched a doll that had no face, just a blank oval of stained muslin where features should have been. Another girl, maybe 7, had a spoon tied to her hip with twine, hanging there like a holster, like it was the most valuable thing she owned. The oldest girl, thin and sun-dark with eyes that had already seen too much, took a step forward. Mara found her voice. "You're lost." "No, ma'am," the girl said quietly. "We're not." "Then you should go home." "Don't have one." The words hung in the heat-thick air. Mara looked past them, scanning the street for an adult, a guardian, someone who should be minding these children. But Main Street was empty except for a wagon tied up outside the saloon and a single crow picking at something dead near the trough. Where are your people? Mara asked. The second oldest girl, maybe 8, spoke up. Her voice was matter-of-fact, like she was reciting a grocery list. Mama died having my brother. He died too. Papa left after that. Haven't seen him in a year. Another girl. My folks got the fever last winter. Both gone same week. Another. My mama ran off with a gambler. My papa drinks now. Doesn't come home much. The spoon girl. Mine are just gone. Don't know where. The 3-year-old didn't speak. She just pressed her faceless doll against her chest and watched Mara with eyes too old for her face. Mara felt something crack in her chest, not breaking, but shifting, like ice starting to thaw. Where do you sleep? The oldest girl, Mara would learn later her name was Jessa, shrugged. Where we can. Under the church steps when Reverend Michaels ain't watching. Behind the Johnsons' barn sometimes. There's a feed shed with a broken door on the edge of town. We fit through the gap. And you eat? When we can. Jessa's voice didn't waver. This was just fact, just the shape of her life, nothing to get emotional about. Folks leave things sometimes. We're quick. We know how to be quiet. Mara's throat had gone tight. She recognized this. The way the world could decide you weren't worth feeding. The way you could be standing right there, visible and breathing, and still people would look straight through you like you were made of glass. The second girl, dark braids, missing a front tooth, stepped forward and held something out. A biscuit. Cracked in half, clearly saved from someone else's breakfast, the edges gone hard in the heat. We thought you might be hungry, she said. Mara stared at the offering. These children who had nothing, who slept in sheds and under stairs, who tied spoons to their hips like treasures, they were trying to feed her. I can't take your food, Mara said, and her voice came out rough. You look hungry, the gap-toothed girl insisted. Hungrier than us. That's not... Mara stopped, because it might be true. When had she last eaten? Yesterday? The day before? Time had gotten slippery lately, days blending together in a haze of heat and defeat. Jessa took another step closer. She was thin as a rail, collarbone sharp under her patched dress, but she held herself with a kind of dignity that made Mara's chest ache. We've been watching you, Jessa said. Sitting here, every day, same bench, like you're waiting for something that ain't coming. Mara looked away. The cottonwoods wavered in the heat shimmer down the street. We know what that's like, another girl said, this one maybe 6, with a scar across her chin that looked like it had healed badly. Waiting for something better. Waiting for folks to remember you're here. The 3-year-old moved then, sudden and decisive. She crossed the space between them and set the biscuit down on the bench beside Mara, patting it with one small, dirt-creased hand. Then she touched the hem of Mara's maroon dress, fingers catching on the rough wool. You're soft, the child whispered, like it was a revelation. Mara's hands were shaking. She folded them tight in her lap, pressing her palms together until the pressure hurt. Why are you here? What do you want from me? Jessa met her eyes dead on. We figured something out, she said. You need a home, and we need a mama. The world tilted. Somewhere a horse whinnied, the loose shutter banged, the cicadas kept screaming their endless summer song. But Mara couldn't hear any of it over the roaring in her ears. I'm not... She stopped. Started again. You don't know me. You don't know what people say. We know they say you're trouble, the gap-toothed girl said. We know they say you're cursed, that you kill men just by marrying them. Mara flinched. But we also know, Jessa continued, voice steady, that you're the only person in this whole damn town who sits on this bench every single day and never once told us to get lost when we walked past. You're the only one who looks at us like we're people instead of problems. That doesn't make me a mother. Don't need a perfect mother, the scarred girl said. Just need someone who won't leave. The smallest one was still touching Mara's dress, small fingers twisted in the fabric now. Please, she whispered. Please don't go. Mara tried to stand, tried to pull away, tried to do what every survival instinct in her body was screaming at her to do. Run, protect yourself, don't let anyone else close enough to hurt you. But 6 pairs of eyes held her there. 6 small faces waiting. 6 children who had already been abandoned by every adult who was supposed to care. standing in the brutal sun and offering her half a biscuit like it was a fortune. I don't have anything, Mara said, and it came out like a confession. I don't have food or money or a roof. I can't even keep myself alive. How am I supposed to? We'll help, Jessa said simply. We know how to find things, how to make do. We just need… She stopped, swallowed hard, and for the first time her voice cracked. We just need someone who stays. The 3-year-old was crying now, silent tears tracking through the dust on her cheeks, but she didn't let go of Mara's dress. Something in Mara broke. Not shattered, broke open, like a fist unclenching, like a door she'd nailed shut finally splintering under pressure. She reached down and picked up the biscuit. It was warm from sitting in the sun, edges crumbling in her fingers. She broke it into 7 pieces, uneven, imperfect, and handed one to each girl, keeping the smallest piece for herself. They ate in silence. The biscuit was dry and tasteless, but Mara had never shared a meal that felt more sacred. When the last crumbs were gone, Jessa wiped her hands on her skirt and asked, "What's your name?" Mara Quinn. I'm Jessa. This is Molly. The gap-toothed girl nodded. And Rue, Tamsin, Nell, and the quiet one's Ivy. Ivy, the 3-year-old, finally released Mara's dress and stepped back. She didn't speak, but she watched Mara with huge, solemn eyes, like she was memorizing her face. Where will you sleep tonight? Mara asked. Same as always, Jessa said. The feed shed, probably. Barns, if it rains. Mara looked down at her hands, calloused, thin, shaking slightly from hunger and something else she couldn't name. There's a tool shed, she heard herself say. Behind the blacksmith's shop. Door doesn't lock anymore. It's not much, but it's got walls. Roof. 6 faces lit up like she'd offered them a palace. You mean it? Molly breathed. Mara didn't know what she meant. Didn't know what she was promising or how she'd keep it, but she nodded anyway, because these children had just fed her when they had nothing, had chosen her when the whole town had written her off, and something about that felt like a covenant she couldn't break even if she wanted to. I mean it, she said. That night, Mara led 6 girls through the alleys of Dry Ridge like a ghost leading ghosts. They moved in shadows, quick and quiet, until they reached the blacksmith's property. The shed sat at the back of the lot, half hidden by a tangle of wild rose bushes and rusted equipment. The door hung crooked on leather hinges, and when Mara pushed it open, the smell of old grease and metal and dust rolled out. Inside was dark and close. No windows. Dirt floor packed hard as stone. Cobwebs thick in the corners. A few broken tools scattered against the walls. But there was space. There was shelter. There was a door. The girls filed in without hesitation, spreading out to claim territory with the efficiency of experienced survivors. Jessa found a relatively clean corner and started sweeping debris away with her foot. Molly pulled a thin quilt from somewhere inside her dress, folded so small Mara hadn't even seen it, and spread it on the ground. Tamsin and Nell dragged an old crate over to use as a table. Rue found a rusted tin cup and held it up like a trophy. Ivy stood in the doorway, faceless doll clutched tight, and looked up at Mara. Waiting. Mara found a candle stub in her pocket. She'd been carrying it for weeks. Some vague idea of light for the dark nights, and lit it with the matches she kept wrapped in oilcloth. The flame caught, small and golden, pushing back the darkness just enough to see 6 small faces watching her with something that looked like hope. It's not much, Mara said. It's got a door, Jessa said. And you. They ate nothing that night because there was nothing to eat. They drank from the tin cup, warm water from the blacksmith's trough that tasted like metal and minerals. They curled up on the dirt floor with the single thin quilt spread over all of them, bodies pressed close for comfort and warmth, even in the summer heat. Mara lay awake long after the girls had fallen asleep, listening to them breathe. Molly snored softly. Tamsin muttered in her sleep. Ivy had one small hand fisted in Mara's sleeve, holding on even in unconsciousness. Outside, Dry Ridge was silent. The heat had broken slightly with nightfall, and a breeze moved through the gap in the door, carrying the smell of dust and dried grass and distance. Mara stared at the ceiling, rough wooden beams barely visible in the candlelight, and wondered what she'd done. These children weren't hers. She had no claim to them, no right, no resources to keep them fed or safe or alive. The town already hated her. Adding 6 orphans to her burden would only make it worse. But Ivy's hand was warm in her sleeve. And for the first time in 2 years, Mara wasn't sleeping alone in the dark, waiting for morning to come and find her still breathing against her will. She closed her eyes and let exhaustion take her. Morning came hot and bright, light spilling through the crooked door in a harsh yellow wedge. Mara woke to find the shed empty except for herself. Panic spiked through her chest. Gone. Of course they're gone. You were a fool to think. Then she saw it. On the bench outside, exactly where she'd sat the day before, something had been left. A single potato, dirt still clinging to its skin, wrapped in a scrap of patchwork cloth. The cloth had been knotted and twisted into the rough shape of a bird, wings spread, crude but deliberate. Mara picked it up, hands shaking. The potato was real, solid, still cool from wherever they'd dug it from. The cloth bird fit in her palm. They'd left her breakfast, a gift, proof they'd been real and not some heat-fevered dream. She sat down on the bench, potato and bird clutched against her chest, and cried for the first time since Jacob died. Not quiet tears, but great heaving sobs that came from somewhere deep and jagged, grief and gratitude and terror all mixed together until she couldn't tell them apart. When she finally stopped, the sun was higher and the street was starting to fill. A wagon rolled past. 2 women walked by on the other side, parasols raised, giving Mara the kind of look reserved for things found dead on the roadside. Mara wiped her face and stood. She had 1 potato, 6 mouths to feed, and no idea what came next. But the girls had come back. They'd left her a gift tied into the shape of a bird, wings spread ready to fly. That had to mean something. She walked back to the shed, pushed open the crooked door, and started taking inventory. Broken tools, rusted nails, a few scraps of burlap, an old grain sack with a hole in the bottom. Not much, but she'd worked with less. By the time the girls returned that evening, slipping through shadows like they'd been doing it their whole lives, Mara had swept the floor, organized the tools, patched the grain sack, and boiled the potato in water heated over a tiny fire she'd built in a dented bucket outside the shed. She'd divided the potato into 7 pieces. Still not enough, still meager, but it was something. The girls ate with the focused silence of the genuinely hungry, not a single piece dropped or wasted. When they were done, Jessa looked at Mara and said, "You stayed." "I stayed," Mara agreed. Ivy climbed into Mara's lap without asking and fell asleep there, faceless doll pressed between them. Mara wrapped her arms around the small body, felt the warmth and weight of her, and thought about how easy it would be to love these children. How dangerous. How completely inevitable. The next morning, Mara woke to find the girls arranged around her like satellites, each one touching her somewhere. A hand on her arm, a head against her shoulder, Ivy still in her lap. She lay very still, afraid to move, and break whatever spell had made this possible. Then Jessa's eyes opened. She looked at Mara for a long moment, something assessing in her gaze. "You're still here?" Jessa whispered. "I'm still here. People usually leave." "I know. You promise you won't?" Mara knew better than to make promises she couldn't keep, knew that life had a way of taking things from you whether you fought or not, but Ivy was a warm weight in her arms, and 5 other girls were watching her with hope that felt like a knife against her ribs. "I promise I'll try," Mara said. It was the most honest thing she could offer. Jessa nodded slowly, like she understood the difference between absolute promises and true ones. "Then we'll try too," she said. Over the next 3 days, they fell into a pattern. The girls disappeared during the daylight hours, scavenging, Mara assumed, or staying out of sight to avoid questions. She used the time to work, taking in mending from the rare person who would hire her, washing clothes at the creek, doing anything that might earn a few cents or a scrap of food. The girls returned every evening with small treasures: a handful of dried beans found behind the general store, a chicken egg stolen from someone's coop, half a loaf of bread gone stale but still edible, a handful of wild onions pulled from the creek bank. They never asked where Mara had been or what she'd done. They just settled into the shed like coming home, ate whatever meager meal she'd managed to scrape together, and fell asleep in a pile of limbs and shared warmth. On the fourth night, Molly taught them a song, something her mother used to sing, words half forgotten but melody intact. They sang it together in the candlelit dark, voices thin and off-key but earnest. On the fifth night, Tamsin confessed she was afraid of thunderstorms. A storm rolled in just after midnight, lightning splitting the sky and thunder rattling the shed's walls. Mara held Tamsin through it, humming nonsense sounds until the child's shaking stopped. On the sixth night, Rue asked Mara if she knew how to read. Mara did. Her first husband, Samuel, had taught her from his mother's old primer. She'd kept the habit after he died, reading anything she could find: newspapers, seed catalogs, the backs of medicine bottles. "I can teach you," Mara said. 6 faces lit up in the candlelight. That's when she knew she was lost. That's when she understood she wasn't going to walk away from this, wasn't going to protect herself, wasn't going to do the smart thing and keep her distance. These girls had crawled into her life like light through cracks, and she was going to fight for them with everything she had left, even though she knew, bone deep and certain, that Dry Ridge was going to fight back. The reckoning came on a Tuesday. Mara was behind the shed, trying to chop kindling from a piece of scrap wood someone had left near the blacksmith's forge. Her hands were blistered, grip uncertain, and when the axe came down wrong, it glanced off the wood and bit into her thumb instead. Blood welled up immediately, bright red against her dusty skin. She hissed in pain, pressing her apron against the cut, watching red seep into the faded fabric. "That needs binding." Mara spun around. A man stood 10 paces away, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a leather apron dark with forge stains. His face was weathered, beard streaked with gray, eyes the color of winter sky. She recognized him immediately. Elias Crow, the blacksmith. The man who owned the shed they'd been sleeping in. The man people whispered about in the same cautious tones they used for her: careful, cursed, best left alone. His wife had died in childbirth 3 years ago. The baby, too. He'd stopped talking to people after that, stopped coming to church, stopped pretending he fit into Dry Ridge's careful social order. He worked, he drank, and he existed in the margins the same way Mara did. He was holding a strip of clean cloth and a small tin that smelled like pine pitch and calendula. "I'm fine," Mara said automatically. Elias didn't argue. He just set the cloth and tin on top of the wood pile, adjusted the axe so it rested properly against the shed wall instead of balanced precariously where it could fall, and walked away. No questions, no judgments, no demands for rent or explanations. Just help, offered and then withdrawn, like it was the simplest thing in the world. Mara stood there bleeding into her apron, watching his broad back disappear into his shop, and felt something in her chest twist sideways. She bound her thumb with the cloth. The salve stung at first, then settled into a cool numbness that made the pain bearable. That night, she told the girls about the blacksmith. "He knows we're here?" Jessa asked, voice tight. "Seems like." "He gonna make us leave?" "He brought me bandages," Mara said. "Not eviction." The girls exchanged glances, that silent communication children developed when they'd survived too much too young. "Maybe he's lonely too," Nell said quietly. Maybe. Or maybe Elias Crow was just the kind of man who understood what it meant to be rejected by the world and decided that meant you didn't kick people who were already down. 2 days later, Mara found a stack of dry firewood outside the shed door. Split clean, stacked neat, no note or explanation. 3 days after that, a dented pot with a working handle set beside the woodpile. A week later, 6 tin spoons, not matching but functional, left in a clean flour sack tied with twine. Elias never said a word, never approached again, just left things the way you'd leave offerings at a shrine, quiet, deliberate, unexplained. The girls began to relax slightly. They still disappeared during the day, still moved through Dry Ridge like ghosts, but they laughed more in the evenings, fought over blanket space, argued about whose turn it was to fetch water, acted like children instead of survivors. Mara taught them letters using scraps of newspaper and a piece of charcoal, started teaching them numbers, found herself making plans, tentative, fragile plans about winter coats and shoes that fit, and maybe, somehow, finding a way to make this permanent. That's when Dry Ridge noticed. She should have known it would happen. Should have known that 6 orphans and a cursed widow living in a shed would eventually become visible to the people who made it their business to maintain order. It started with Baker Morrison's son, a thick-necked boy of 15 who'd already learned every ugly lesson his father had to teach. He caught sight of Mara and the girls walking back from the creek one afternoon, all of them carrying buckets of wash water, and he stepped into their path. "Well, well," he said, voice dripping with casual cruelty. "Look at this. The widow's collected herself a little pack of strays." Mara stopped walking. Behind her, 6 girls went very still. "Let us pass, Thomas." "Why? You got somewhere important to be? Some shed you crawled into?" Thomas grinned, showing teeth that needed brushing. "My pa says you're nothing but trouble. Says those girls need proper homes, not some cursed woman playing house in Elias Crow's garbage pile." Mara's hands tightened on her bucket handle. "Your father should mind his business. His business is keeping this town respectable, and you ain't respectable. Neither are they." He jerked his chin at the girls. "Strays belong in pens, or the county home where they can't bother decent folk." Something in Mara went very quiet, very cold. She'd heard this kind of talk before, about herself, about people who didn't fit, about anyone the town decided wasn't worth the space they occupied. She'd learned to duck her head and take it, to make herself small and invisible and unthreatening. But she wasn't alone anymore. 6 pairs of eyes were watching her, waiting to see what she'd do, waiting to see if she'd fight or fold. Mara set down her bucket, stepped forward, planted herself between Thomas Morrison and the girls like a wall made of grief and refusal. Her voice came out quiet, sharp as broken glass. "If I'm trouble," she said, "then stop expecting me to beg for a place in your world. I'm done apologizing for breathing." "And these girls?" She glanced back at them. Small, scared, defiant. "They chose me. Not a perfect mother, not a respectable one. Me. And I choose them right back." Thomas's grin faltered. "You can't just—" "I already did." Mara's voice didn't rise, but it cut through his bluster like a knife. "Now get out of our way." For a moment she thought he'd push back, thought he'd escalate, call for help, make this into something she couldn't walk away from. But something in her eyes must have shown him she meant it, that she was done being convenient and invisible, that she'd burn the whole town down before she let him take these children. Thomas stepped aside, muttering curses, but he stepped aside. Mara picked up her bucket. "Come on, girls." They walked past him in a silent line, heads high, not running even though Mara could feel how badly they wanted to. When they were safely back at the shed, Jessa turned to Mara and said, "You stood up for us." "Of course I did." "No one ever does that." Jessa's voice cracked. "No one ever tells them to stop." Mara knelt down, meeting Jessa's eyes level. "I'm done letting people decide you don't matter. You matter. All of you. And anyone who says different will have to go through me first." 6 girls stared at her like she'd just promised them the moon. That night, they didn't just sleep in a pile. They held on to each other like family, like people who belonged to each other, like something worth fighting for. And outside, in the darkness beyond the crooked shed door, Mara knew the fight was just beginning. The trouble started small, the way it always does in towns like Dry Ridge. Whispers at first, then pamphlets, then men with notebooks who asked questions like they already knew the answers and were just waiting for you to lie. The morning after Mara faced down Thomas Morrison, she woke to find something nailed to the shed door. A single sheet of paper, edges crisp, words printed in stern black ink. "Orphaned children belong in proper institutions where they can receive moral instruction and lawful guardianship. Vagrancy will not be tolerated." No signature, no official seal, just a warning dressed up as civic concern. Mara tore it down before the girls woke, crumpling it in her fist until her knuckles went white. She burned it in the morning fire, watching the edges curl and blacken, ash rising into the pale dawn sky like accusations she couldn't quite escape. But word had already spread. She could feel it in the way people stared now when she walked through town, not just avoiding her, but watching her with a new kind of attention, calculating, measuring, waiting to see what she'd do next and whether it would give them ammunition. The girls felt it too. They moved more carefully now, spoke more quietly, looked over their shoulders with the wariness of rabbits who'd caught a predator's scent. Are they going to take us? Molly asked one evening, gap-toothed mouth pulled into a worried line. Mara was mending a tear in Rue's dress by candlelight, needle moving through worn fabric with the automatic precision of long practice. She didn't look up. Not if I can help it, but what if they try? Then they'll have to try harder than they've ever tried anything in their comfortable lives. Mara bit through the thread, knotted it, held up the dress to check her work. You're not property, you're not problems. You're children who deserve to be safe and warm and fed, and I don't care what some pamphlet says about proper institutions. Jessa was sitting against the wall, teaching Nell how to spell her name using charcoal on a flat stone. She paused, stick of charcoal hovering. What if proper's better than this, though? What if they're right and we're just being stubborn? Mara set down the dress, looked at Jessa directly, this girl who was too young to carry so much weight, but did it anyway because someone had to. You've been to the county home, haven't you? Jessa's jaw tightened, nodded once. Tell me about it. Cold, Jessa said quietly. Too many kids, not enough food. They split us up by age and you couldn't talk to your kin even if they were 2 rooms over. Matron hit you for crying, hit you for talking back, hit you for looking at her wrong. She dragged the charcoal across the stone, leaving a dark, angry streak. I ran after 3 weeks, walked back here and figured starving free was better than being caged proper. Tamsin spoke up, voice small. My cousin went to one over in Cheyenne. Wrote letters for a while saying it wasn't bad. Then the letters stopped. My aunt went to check and they said she'd run off. Never found her. Nell was crying silently, tears tracking through the dust on her cheeks. Ivy had crawled into Mara's lap and was clutching the faceless doll so tightly the muslin was creasing. Mara wrapped her arms around Ivy, pulled her close. Proper doesn't mean good, she said. It just means people can sleep at night without feeling guilty about what they're ignoring. You want to go to a place like that? 6 heads shook in unison. Then we don't let them take you. But how? Rue asked. They got the law. They got the church. They got everything. Mara didn't have an answer for that. She had $10 that had dwindled to 7. She had a shed with a crooked door and a blacksmith who left firewood without explanation. She had grief and stubbornness and 6 children who trusted her for reasons she still couldn't fully understand. It should have been nowhere near enough. We make it impossible to ignore us, Mara said slowly, the plan forming as she spoke. We stop hiding. We walk through this town like we belong here because we do. We make ourselves so visible, so undeniably real, that they can't just sweep us away like dust. Jessa's eyes narrowed. That's dangerous. So is doing nothing. They sat with that for a moment, the weight of it pressing down like the summer heat that never quite broke even after sunset. Finally, Jessa nodded, decision made, and the other girls followed her lead the way they always did. Okay, Jessa said. We try it your way. The next morning, Mara braided all 6 girls' hair with a care that bordered on ceremony. She used water heated in the dented pot, worked out the tangles with patient fingers, plaited the dark and light and copper strands into neat rows that wouldn't come loose easily. She tore strips from the hem of her own morning dress, already threadbare, a few more inches wouldn't matter, and tied the braids off with maroon wool instead of twine. She scrubbed their faces, mended every tear in their clothes she could find, made sure their boots were laced even if they didn't match, made them look like children instead of strays. Then she took Ivy's hand, and Ivy took Molly's, and Molly took Tamsin's, and they formed a chain, Mara and 6 girls walking down Main Street in full daylight like they had every right to be there. People stopped and stared. Conversations died mid-sentence. A woman pulling bread from the bakery window actually dropped the loaf, mouth falling open. Mara kept walking, spine straight, head high. The girls matched her pace, small hands gripping tight but footsteps steady. They walked past the mercantile, past the saloon, past the church, with its whitewashed steeple and judgmental bell. Walked all the way to the far end of town where the road dissolved into prairie grass and distance, then turned around and walked back. Nobody stopped them. Nobody said a word, but everybody watched. When they returned to the shed, Mara's hands were shaking from adrenaline and fear and something that might have been pride. They'd done it. They'd claimed space. They'd refused to be invisible. That was terrifying, Nell whispered. I know, Mara said. Can we do it again tomorrow? Mara laughed, sharp and surprised and genuine. Yes, we can do it every day if we need to. So they did. Every morning for a week, they walked through Dry Ridge like a small defiant parade. Sometimes Mara taught them songs and they sang as they walked. Old hymns with the religious parts forgotten, folk songs about rivers and mountains, nonsense rhymes that made Ivy giggle. Sometimes they just walked in silence, present and undeniable. The town didn't know what to do with them. Mara could see the frustration building in certain faces, Baker Morrison especially, who looked at her like she was a stain on his carefully maintained reputation. But walking wasn't a crime, being visible wasn't illegal. She hadn't given them grounds to act, not yet. The first crack in their fragile peace came from an unexpected direction. Mara was behind the shed, trying to wash clothes in a bucket of creek water, when she heard voices from the blacksmith shop, male voices, raised in argument. Can't keep enabling this, Elias. It's not right. Enabling what? Giving a woman some firewood? You know what I mean. That Quinn woman and those strays. They're living in your shed, using your property, and you're just letting it happen like it's normal. They're not hurting anything. They're hurting the town's reputation. We got standards, Crow. We got order. You can't just let vagrancy set up camp on your land and pretend it's charity. There was a long pause. Then Elias spoke, voice low and harder than Mara had heard it. You want to talk about reputation, Morrison? Let's talk about how your boy threw rocks at those girls last week and called them names I won't repeat. Let's talk about how half this town would rather children sleep in ditches than admit we failed them. That's not... Get out of my shop. Elias. Out. Footsteps. The shop door slamming. Then silence. Mara stood very still, hands dripping soap and water, heart hammering against her ribs. Elias Crow had just defended her, had just picked a fight with one of Dry Ridge's most prominent citizens over firewood and shed space and the right of unwanted people to exist. She didn't know what to do with that information, didn't know if it made things better or worse, didn't know if she should thank him or avoid him, or pretend she'd heard nothing. Before she could decide, Elias appeared around the corner of the shed. He stopped when he saw her, took in the bucket and wet clothes and her obvious awareness of what had just happened. How much did you hear? He asked. Enough. He nodded slowly, looked like he might say something, then changed his mind, started to walk away. Why? Mara asked. Elias turned back. Why what? Why defend me? Why leave firewood and pots and spoons? Why let us stay when it would be easier to make us leave? He was quiet for a long moment, jaw working like he was chewing on words too difficult to spit out. Finally he said, My wife's name was Catherine. When she was pregnant, she got sick. Not the kind that kills you fast, but the kind that makes every day harder than the last. Toward the end, she couldn't walk to the well, couldn't cook, could barely get out of bed. Mara waited. Town ladies came by, Elias continued, brought casseroles and advice and judgment wrapped up in concern, told Catherine she needed to try harder, pray more, think positive thoughts, like dying was a choice she was making wrong. His voice went rough. After she and the baby were gone, those same ladies told me I needed to move on, find a new wife, forget about grief because it made people uncomfortable. I'm sorry, Mara said quietly. Don't be sorry. Just understand. Elias met her eyes, and she saw grief there that matched her own. Old, settled, permanent as scars. I know what this town does to people it decides aren't worth helping. I know what it's like to be the problem instead of the person. So when I see you trying to keep those girls fed and safe with nothing but stubbornness and a shed with a broken door, he shrugged, figured the least I could do was not make it harder. Something in Mara's chest unclenched. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. Morrison's not going to let this go. He's got the ear of the county magistrate, and he's been making noise about proper placement for orphan children. You should prepare for official trouble. How official? Men with notebooks, questions about fitness and resources, maybe a home inspection if they're feeling thorough. Elias's expression darkened. They'll try to make it look like concern for the children, but what they really want is to clear out anything that makes the town look bad before the railroad investors come through next month. Mara's stomach dropped. Railroad investors. Dry Ridge is trying to get a spur line. Means money, growth, respectability. Can't have that if the first thing visitors see is a widow and 6 strays living in a shed. He said it matter-of-factly, like it was obvious. You're bad for business. That makes you expendable. The words settled over Mara like a sentence. She'd been expendable before. To her father, who'd married her off young. To her first husband's family, who'd blamed her for his death. To Jacob's friends, who'd stopped visiting after the funeral. But this was different. This time, she wasn't alone. "What do I do?" she asked. Elias considered. "Make it harder to dismiss you. Give them something they can't ignore. Not just visibility, but legitimacy. Show them you're not just surviving, you're building something. I don't have money. I don't have—" "You have those girls. You have stubbornness. And you have—" He gestured vaguely at the shed. "Hell, I don't know. But you've made it this far. That counts for something." He left before she could respond, disappearing back into his shop where the forge glowed orange and waiting. Mara stood in the harsh sunlight, wet clothes forgotten, mind racing. Make it harder to dismiss you. Build something. She looked at the shed, rough walls, crooked door, roof that leaked when it rained. Looked at her hands, calloused and scarred and stronger than she remembered. Looked at the space behind the shed where wild roses grew thick and thorny, creating a natural fence that blocked the view from the street. An idea began to form. Dangerous. Possibly stupid, but the kind of defiance that felt like breathing after holding your breath too long. That evening, when the girls returned from whatever scavenging or avoiding they'd done during the day, Mara gathered them in the shed and laid out her plan. "We're going to build something," she said. "Something real. Something they can't just sweep away and pretend never existed." 6 faces looked at her with varying degrees of hope and skepticism. "Build what?" Jessa asked. "A home," Mara said. "An actual home. Not just a shed we're borrowing, but something that's ours. Something that proves we're not just squatting or waiting to be rescued. Something that says we belong here and we're not leaving." Molly's eyes went wide. "How?" "There's lumber," Mara said, thinking out loud. "Behind the old Hutchins place, there's a chicken coop that collapsed last winter. Nobody's touched it. Wood's probably still good. And I've seen bent nails scattered all over this town. People throw them away instead of straightening them because new nails are cheap." "We could collect them," Rue said, catching on. "Straighten them out. Make them work again." Exactly. Mara felt energy building in her chest, the first genuine hope she'd felt in months. We scavenge what we can. We build what we need. We show this town that we're not asking permission anymore. "But we don't know how to build," Nell said. "Then we learn." Mara looked at each of them in turn. "We've learned how to survive on nothing. We can learn how to build something from scraps. People have done more with less." Tamsin spoke up, voice careful. "What if they stop us? What if the law comes and says we can't? Then we make them say it to our faces while we're holding hammers and building anyway." Mara's voice came out fiercer than she intended. "I'm done asking this town for permission to exist. Are you?" The question hung in the close air of the shed. Outside, cicadas sang their endless summer song. A horse whinnied somewhere distant. The world kept turning, indifferent to 7 people deciding to fight back. Jessa stood up, extended her hand to Mara like they were sealing a bargain. "Let's build something." One by one, the other girls stood too, placed their hands on top of Jessa's and Mara's, creating a tower of small palms and scarred fingers and shared determination. "Let's build something," they echoed. The work started the next morning before dawn, when the heat was still bearable and the town was barely awake. Mara and the girls crept through alleys to the collapsed chicken coop behind the old Hutchins property, moving quiet as thieves even though technically they weren't stealing, just reclaiming what had been abandoned. The coop had fallen in on itself, roof caved and walls scattered, but the wood was still good, sun-dried and weathered but solid. Mara showed the girls how to test each board, looking for rot, checking for splits, keeping anything that would hold a nail. They worked in silence, hauling boards back to the shed 2 or 3 at a time, hiding them behind the wild roses where passers-by wouldn't notice. By the time the sun was fully up and Dry Ridge was stirring, they'd moved half the coop and were exhausted but exhilarated. "Tomorrow we get the rest," Jessa said, wiping sweat from her forehead and leaving a streak of dirt behind. Then we start on nails. Finding nails became a scavenger hunt that consumed their days. The girls fanned out across Dry Ridge, eyes sharp for the glint of metal in dirt roads, behind buildings, in trash heaps. They found bent nails, rusted nails, nails with heads broken off or points dulled, brought them back to the shed like treasure. Mara taught them how to straighten nails using a flat stone and patient tapping. It was tedious work, but it gave them something to do with their hands while they talked, while they planned, while they became something more solid than survival. Elias never said a word about the lumber appearing behind his shed or the sound of hammering that started each morning. But one evening, Mara found a claw hammer with a cracked handle sitting on their woodpile, and the next day a carpenter's square appeared, old and rust-spotted but still true. Tools without explanation, help without demands for gratitude. Mara was beginning to understand that this was how Elias Crow loved, quietly, practically, through things he could fix or provide when words failed him. 2 weeks into their building project, the county man arrived. Mara was measuring boards with the carpenter's square, while Molly and Tamsin practiced hammering nails into scrap wood, learning how to hit straight and true without bending the metal. The sound of hoofbeats made her look up. A man on a gray horse, wearing a suit too heavy for the summer heat and carrying a leather satchel that marked him as official something. He dismounted, tied his horse to the post outside the blacksmith's shop, and walked directly toward the shed with the purposeful stride of someone executing a duty. "Mrs. Quinn?" he said. Mara set down the square slowly. "Yes." "I'm Walter Finch, County Magistrate's Office. I'm here to conduct a welfare inquiry regarding the children currently in your care." He pulled a notebook from his satchel, flipped it open. 6 minors, ages ranging from approximately 3 to 10 years, living without legal guardianship or adequate provisions. The girls had gone very still. Ivy had moved behind Mara's skirt, one small hand twisted in the fabric. Jessa stood rigid, jaw clenched, looking like she was preparing to run or fight. "They have provisions," Mara said evenly, "and they have me." "You're not their legal guardian, Mrs. Quinn. You have no official claim to these children. Neither does anyone else." Finch's expression didn't change. "The county has an obligation to ensure the welfare of orphaned minors. That means proper housing, education, moral instruction, and adult supervision from qualified individuals. I'm supervising them. With all due respect, ma'am, you're a widow with no fixed address, no reliable income, and a reputation that," he paused delicately, "raises questions about your fitness as a guardian." Mara felt fury rise hot and sharp in her throat. She forced it down, forced herself to stay calm because losing control would only prove whatever point he'd already decided to make. Questions from who? People who've never once asked these girls what they need or want? People who'd rather ship them off to institutions than admit this town failed them? "The county home provides—" "I know what it provides." Mara's voice went cold. "Fear, hunger, separation from everyone you love, a matron who hits you for crying. That's what you're offering these children." Finch's jaw tightened. "I understand you're emotional about this, but don't." Mara stepped forward. "Don't you dare call this emotion like it's something unreasonable. These girls have names. They have needs. They have a right to be somewhere they're wanted instead of warehoused like inconvenient cargo. They also have a right to stability, to legal protection, to a future that doesn't depend on the charity of someone who can barely feed herself." The words hit like a slap because they were partially true. Mara was barely feeding herself, was living in a shed, had nothing to offer these children except stubbornness and love and a willingness to fight. But sometimes that was enough. "Mr. Finch," Mara said quietly, "what exactly are you here to do?" He consulted his notebook. "I'm authorized to conduct a preliminary assessment. If I find the living conditions inadequate or the guardian unfit, I'm to report back to the magistrate with recommendations for removal and placement. And if I refuse to let you assess anything, then I return with a sheriff and a court order." He said it without malice, just stating fact. "This can be easy or difficult, Mrs. Quinn. The outcome will be the same." Mara looked at the girls, at Jessa, whose hands had curled into fists, at Molly, whose gap-toothed mouth was trembling. At Ivy, who was crying silently behind Mara's skirt, faceless doll clutched to her chest. She thought about running, about gathering these children and disappearing into the prairie before official trouble could catch up. But running meant leaving the shed, the lumber, the tools, the small piece of ground they'd started to claim. Running meant admitting defeat. "Fine," Mara said. "Assess." Finch spent 20 minutes examining the shed with clinical detachment. Noted the dirt floor, the crooked door, the lack of proper beds or furniture. Counted the girls, asked their names, recorded their ages in his notebook with neat, precise handwriting. "Where do they sleep?" he asked. "Together, on quilts." "Education?" "I teach them. Reading, writing, numbers." "Meals?" "We manage." "That's not an answer, Mrs. Quinn." Mara met his eyes. "We eat what we can find or afford. Same as half the families in this territory. Hunger isn't grounds for removal unless you plan to empty out every homestead from here to Cheyenne." Finch made another note. "Medical care? Haven't needed a doctor. Religious instruction? They can think for themselves." His pen paused. "You're not providing moral education?" "I'm teaching them to read and be kind and survive in a world that treats children like inconveniences. If that's not moral enough for you, I don't know what is." Finch closed his notebook with a sharp snap. "I've seen enough. And? My report will recommend removal pending suitable placement. The magistrate will make the final determination, but given the conditions—" He gestured vaguely at the shed. "I don't anticipate much resistance." Mara's vision went white at the edges. "You can't just—" "I can and will, Mrs. Quinn. These children deserve better than this." He mounted his gray horse, settling into the saddle with bureaucratic finality. "You'll receive official notice within the week. I'd advise you to prepare the children for transition. It'll be easier if they're cooperative." He rode away, dust rising from his horse's hooves, leaving Mara standing in the brutal sunlight with 6 girls pressed against her like she was the only solid thing in a world determined to break them apart. Nobody spoke for a long moment. Then Jessa said, voice shaking with fury and fear, "We run, tonight. We take what we can carry, and we just go." "No," Mara said. "But he's gonna—" "I know what he's going to do." Mara knelt down, pulling all 6 girls close, creating a circle of arms and small bodies, and shared desperation. "But running just proves him right, proves we're temporary, proves we don't belong." "Then what?" Molly whispered. Mara looked at the lumber stacked behind the shed, at the straightened nails lined up in careful rows, at the hammer and square and all the small pieces of a plan they'd just started to build. "We build faster," she said. They worked through the night like people possessed, hands moving by moonlight, and the small glow of candles they couldn't afford to waste but burned anyway. Mara laid out the foundation while the girls hauled lumber, sorted nails, fetched water to mix with the clay-thick dirt that would serve as mortar between gaps. The air was finally cool after weeks of relentless heat, and they used every degree of mercy the temperature gave them. Jessa and Molly held boards steady while Mara hammered, the sound echoing sharp across the quiet settlement. Rue and Tamsin packed mud and straw into cracks, small fingers surprisingly deft at the work. Nell kept Ivy occupied by teaching her to sort nails by size, turning labor into a game that kept the smallest one from crying. By dawn, they'd raised the skeleton of a wall. One wall, rough and uneven and held together with bent nails and desperation, but standing. Mara stepped back, hands blistered and bleeding, and felt something break open in her chest that wasn't quite hope, but was close enough to fool her into thinking they had a chance. "It's real," Molly whispered, touching the wall like she expected it to vanish. "We're really building it." "We're really building it," Mara confirmed. They slept for 3 hours in the old shed, piled together in exhausted heaps, then woke and started again. The sun climbed brutal and white, turning the world into an anvil. But they didn't stop. Couldn't stop. They had less than a week before official notice arrived, before men with authority came to take the girls away to places with rules and rations, and matrons who hit you for being human. Elias appeared mid-morning with a jar of water and a look of quiet assessment. He studied their work without comment, walked the perimeter of their rough foundation, tested the stability of the wall they'd raised. Then he disappeared into his shop and returned with a saw, a level, and an expression that said he'd made a decision. "You're building the frame wrong," he said. "Corners need bracing, or the whole thing will collapse in the first wind." Mara bristled. "I'm doing the best I can with—" "I know. That's why I'm helping." He set down the tools. "You want this to stand, or you want it to look like you tried?" The girls had stopped working, watching this exchange with the wariness of children who'd learned that adult help usually came with conditions. Mara understood their hesitation because she felt it too. Accepting help meant owing something, and owing something meant vulnerability. But they were already vulnerable, already exposed, already fighting a battle they'd probably lose. "We want it to stand," Mara said quietly. Elias nodded once. "Then let me show you how to brace a corner." He worked alongside them for the rest of the day, speaking in short, practical sentences that taught without condescending. Showed Jessa how to measure twice and cut once. Taught Molly the difference between a finishing nail and a framing nail. Helped Mara understand load-bearing versus decorative, structure versus aesthetic. He didn't smile or make conversation beyond instruction, but his presence steadied them in a way Mara hadn't expected. By evening, they had 2 walls standing and the frame for a third. It was rough work, amateur and obvious, but it was solid. It would hold. Elias straightened, wiping sawdust from his hands. "You need a roof before the inspectors come. Walls mean nothing if there's no shelter." "I know," Mara said. "I just don't know where to get—" "There's tin sheeting behind the livery. Been sitting there since the owner died. Nobody's claimed it." Elias's voice was carefully neutral. "Might still be there if someone had a use for it." It wasn't quite an offer and not quite permission, but it was close enough. "Thank you," Mara said. Elias looked at the girls who were covered in dust and sweat and determination, then back at Mara. "You know this might not be enough, right? Building something doesn't guarantee they'll let you keep them." "I know." Mara's voice came out steadier than she felt. "But at least they'll have to look at what we made before they tear it down. At least we'll have tried." Something flickered across Elias's weathered face. Respect, maybe, or recognition of a kindred stubbornness. "I'll be in my shop if you need tools," he said, then left before Mara could thank him again. That night, they stole the tin sheeting. It felt wrong calling it stealing when the owner was 3 years dead and the livery was falling apart from neglect. But Mara had long since stopped caring about the fine moral distinctions that let respectable people sleep at night. They hauled the sheets back in darkness, metal scraping and clanging despite their best efforts at silence, and stashed them behind the wild roses where their construction site was slowly transforming into something that might actually be called a structure. The girls collapsed into sleep still wearing their boots, too tired to even remove the day's dust. Mara lay awake listening to them breathe, counting the days until the official notice arrived, calculating how much they could build in the time they had left. 3 days. Maybe 4 if they were lucky. It would have to be enough. The next morning brought unexpected help from an unexpected source. Mara was trying to figure out how to attach tin roofing without proper rivets when a wagon pulled up outside the blacksmith's shop. A woman climbed down, older and round-faced, wearing a dress that had been fine once but was now faded from washing and sun. "You're the Quinn widow," she said. Not a question. Mara straightened, hammer in hand, ready for another lecture about propriety or vagrancy or whatever judgment this woman had driven over to deliver. "I am. I'm Helen Bartlett. I live about 10 miles south, run a farm with my son since my husband passed." She looked at the construction site, at the girls who had stopped working to watch this interaction with wary eyes. "Heard you're building something." "We are. Also heard the county's planning to take those girls away from you." Mara's grip tightened on the hammer. "That's their plan." Helen nodded slowly. "My sister's boy went to the county home over in Laramie. Came back 2 years later with scars on his back and nightmares that still wake him up screaming. He's 17 now, won't let anyone touch him, flinches at loud noises." She met Mara's eyes directly. "I don't hold with what the county calls care for children." "Neither do I. Which is why I brought you these." Helen reached into her wagon and pulled out a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. Hinges. Real ones, not bent nails and hope. And a proper latch for your door, because if you're building a home, those girls deserve to be able to lock it. Mara stared at the bundle, throat tight. I can't pay you. Didn't ask you to. Helen pressed the wrapped hinges into Mara's hands. I also can't come back here and help publicly because my son does business in Dry Ridge and we can't afford to make enemies, but she glanced at the girls again. I can forget I saw a woman and 6 children out here building something worth protecting. And if anyone asks me what I think, I can tell them that what I saw looked a hell of a lot more like a home than anything the county provides. She climbed back into her wagon before Mara could respond, snapped the reins, and was gone in a cloud of dust and dignity. Molly touched the oilcloth wrapping with reverent fingers. She gave us hinges. She gave us more than that, Jessa said quietly. She gave us a witness. Mara understood. One person willing to say they'd seen something worth defending. One person willing to stand against the narrative that painted Mara as unfit and the girls as better off elsewhere. It wasn't much, but it was something. They installed the hinges that afternoon, attaching a real door to the frame they'd built. The door was rough cut from the coop lumber, gaps showing daylight in places, but it swung on proper hardware and closed with a satisfying solidity. Nell worked the latch over and over, delighting in the simple mechanical reality of being able to shut the world out. We can lock it, she kept saying. We can actually lock it. The concept seemed to mean everything to her. This idea that they could create boundaries, could claim space and defend it with something as simple as a latch. Mara watched her and wondered how many doors had been locked against this child, how many times she'd been shut out of places that should have been safe. You can lock it, Mara confirmed. This is your door now, your space. By the end of the 3rd day, they had 4 walls, a door, and half a roof. The tin sheeting was harder to work with than Mara had anticipated. Sharp edges that cut without warning, weight that required multiple hands to maneuver, angles that refused to cooperate with their amateur attempts at weatherproofing. But Elias showed them how to overlap the sheets to shed rain, how to secure them with the nails they'd straightened and rehammered into service, how to create something that would stand against wind and weather. They worked until their hands bled and their backs screamed and the sunset turned the prairie into liquid gold. Then they worked longer, by lantern light, because time was a luxury they didn't have, and stopping meant thinking about what was coming. On the 4th day, a crowd gathered. Mara noticed them first, townspeople standing at a distance, watching the construction with expressions ranging from curiosity to disgust. Baker Morrison was there, arms crossed, face set in lines of righteous disapproval. The banker's wife. The preacher from the church who'd never once asked why 6 children were sleeping rough. A handful of others who'd made their opinions about Mara clear through months of calculated silence. They're watching us, Rue whispered, hammer going still in her hand. Let them watch, Mara said, louder than necessary. We're not doing anything wrong. Depends on your definition of wrong, Morrison called out. That's unlawful construction on property you don't own, using materials you didn't pay for, housing children you got no legal right to. Mara set down her hammer and walked to the edge of their building site, putting herself between the crowd and the girls. The property owner hasn't objected. The materials were abandoned, and those children have every right to be somewhere they're safe and wanted. Safe? Morrison's laugh was harsh. You call this safe? Ramshackle walls and stolen tin? You're playing house with other people's children, Quinn, and when that roof collapses or those walls fall in, their blood will be on your hands, same as your dead husband's. The crowd murmured. Mara felt the girls press closer behind her, felt Ivy's small hand grip her skirt. My husband's died from accidents and fever, Mara said, voice cold and level. Not for me. But you keep telling that story, if it makes you feel better about turning children away from your doors. We didn't turn them away. We offered them proper placement. You offered them institutions, warehouses, places where children disappear into numbers and nobody checks if they're actually cared for or just stored until they're old enough to be someone else's problem. Mara stepped forward. These girls have names, Jessa, Molly, Rue, Tamsin, Nell, and Ivy. They have histories and hopes, and they deserve better than your proper placement. The preacher spoke up then, voice dripping with false compassion. Mrs. Quinn, no one doubts your intentions, but good intentions don't feed children or keep them safe through winter. What you're doing here is admirable in its way, but it's not sustainable. It's not responsible. And what you're doing is? Mara felt fury rising hot and bright. Standing there judging while children sleep in sheds and ditches? Preaching charity on Sundays and crossing the street to avoid helping Monday through Saturday? You want to talk about responsibility? Show me one person in this crowd who offered these girls shelter before I did. Show me one act of actual Christian kindness from this town that claims to care so much about moral instruction. Silence. The crowd shifted uncomfortably, some looking away, others doubling down on their disapproval. This is exactly the problem, Morrison said. You're angry and irrational, making poor decisions based on emotion instead of, I'm making the only decision that matters. Mara's voice cut through his condescension like a blade. I'm choosing these children. I'm building them a home. And I'm doing it whether you approve or not, because your approval was never worth the breath it would take to ask for. She turned her back on the crowd, a calculated dismissal, and walked back to where the girls stood watching with wide eyes. We done talking? Jessa asked quietly. We're done. Mara picked up her hammer. Let's finish this roof. They worked while the crowd watched, every nail driven with extra force, every board placed with defiant precision. Some of the townspeople drifted away after a while, bored or uncomfortable with being forced to witness what they'd rather ignore. But a few stayed, including Morrison, like they were waiting for the inevitable collapse that would prove their judgment correct. It didn't collapse. The roof held. By evening, they had completed shelter, rough and imperfect, gaps showing in places, the whole structure leaning slightly to the left, but standing, real, undeniable. Mara stepped back and looked at what they'd built. A small structure, maybe 12 feet square, with walls cobbled from collapsed chicken coops and a roof made of salvaged tin. The door hung slightly crooked despite Elias's help. The windows were just open gaps covered with oilcloth because glass was impossible. But it was shelter. It was theirs. We did it, Molly breathed. We actually did it. The girls rushed the door together, crowding inside to test the space, voices echoing in the emptiness. They measured it with their bodies, lying down head to foot to see how many would fit, standing in corners, claiming territory with the fierce possessiveness of people who'd never had anything to claim before. Mara stood in the doorway watching them, and for the first time in years felt something that might have been pride. Then she saw the rider. Same gray horse, same official bearing. Walter Finch, the county magistrate's man, returning ahead of schedule with a leather satchel and an expression that said nothing good. Mrs. Quinn, he said, dismounting, I see you've been busy. Building a home isn't illegal, Mr. Finch. Building without permits, on land you don't own, using materials of questionable provenance. He pulled out his notebook. There are ordinances about that sort of thing. Then write me a citation, but you can't take these girls because I built them shelter. Finch walked around the structure, examining it with the same clinical detachment he'd used on the shed. Tested the walls, checked the roof, ran his hand along the doorframe. It's inadequate, he said finally. No foundation, no insulation. Those gaps in the walls will let in cold and rain. This wouldn't last one hard winter. Then I'll improve it before winter comes. With what resources? You have no income, Mrs. Quinn, no savings, no legal claim to these children or this land. He closed his notebook. The magistrate has reviewed my initial report and agrees with my assessment. Removal proceedings will begin tomorrow morning. The world tilted. Mara heard the words, but they didn't make sense. Couldn't make sense because they'd built something real and visible, and that was supposed to matter. Tomorrow? Her voice came out thin. You said within the week. The magistrate expedited the process given the urgency of the situation. Finch's tone was apologetic but firm. A wagon will arrive at 8 o'clock. The children will be transported to a temporary holding facility in Cheyenne until permanent placements can be arranged. You can't. I can and will, Mrs. Quinn. I have the authority and the paperwork. He pulled a folded document from his satchel, official seals visible on the cream-colored paper. This is a court order removing 6 minor children from unsuitable conditions. You can read it if you'd like, but the details won't change. Mara took the paper with hands that had gone numb. The words swam in front of her eyes. whereas and hereby, and legal authority to remove. Her name spelled out in formal script. The girls listed by approximate age since nobody knew their exact birthdays. Evidence of unfitness including, but not limited to, inadequate housing, insufficient resources, questionable moral character. She'd known this was coming, had known from the moment Finch first arrived that building something wouldn't be enough, that the law had already decided and everything else was just theater. But knowing it and feeling it crush down on her chest like a physical weight were different things. 8 o'clock, Finch repeated. I'd advise you to have them ready. Resistance will only make it harder on everyone involved. He rode away, leaving Mara standing in front of the structure they'd built with bleeding hands and desperate hope, holding a court order that made it all meaningless. The girls had gone silent inside. When Mara turned, they were all pressed against the far wall, Ivy crying quietly, the others trying not to. We have to run, Jessa said again, voice breaking. Right now, right? Tonight. We take what we can and we just go. Where? Mara asked gently. Where would we run that they couldn't find us? Where would we go that would be better than this? Anywhere. Montana, Colorado. We could disappear. They'd track us down. I'd be charged with kidnapping. You'd still end up in institutions, just with me in prison and unable to help at all. Mara crossed to them, pulling all 6 into her arms. Running isn't the answer. Then what is? Molly's gap-toothed mouth was trembling. How do we fight a court order? Mara didn't have an answer. She held them while they cried, while the sun set and darkness filled their new structure, while the weight of tomorrow morning pressed down like a physical thing. Finally, Nell spoke up, voice small but steady. We don't go quietly. What? Mara pulled back to look at her. Mr. Finch said resistance would make it harder on everyone, so we resist. Nell's eyes were red from crying, but determined. Not by running, not by hiding, but by making them see us, really see us. Make them say to our faces that what we built doesn't matter, that we don't matter. Tamsin nodded slowly. Make them take us from a home instead of a shed. Make them look at what we made and destroy it anyway. They'll do it, Jessa said bitterly. They'll take us no matter what we say or do. Maybe, Mara agreed. Probably. But Nell's right about one thing. We don't go quietly. We don't make it easy. We make them see exactly what they're taking. She looked at each of them in the darkness. These 6 girls who'd chosen her when the world had thrown them both away. Thought about the biscuit they'd offered when they had nothing. The potato wrapped like a bird. The way they'd worked through nights and heat and blistered hands to build something real. Tomorrow morning, Mara said slowly, we're going to show them what a home looks like. We're going to show them what we are, not strays or problems or cases to be managed, but a family. And if they still take you after that, at least you'll know you were worth fighting for. How? Rue asked. Mara stood, mind racing. We finish this tonight. We make this place undeniable. We show them that we're not just surviving, we're living, we're building, we're becoming something they can't dismiss. The girls looked at each other, that silent communication passing between them. Then, one by one, they stood. What do we need? Jessa asked. Mara surveyed their rough structure. Everything that makes a house a home. We have walls and a roof. Now we need to make it somewhere people actually live. They worked through the night again, but this time it wasn't frantic construction. It was transformation. They swept the dirt floor until it was packed smooth and even, arranged their few quilts into sleeping spaces that looked intentional instead of desperate, used scrap wood to build a rough table and benches, hung the tin cup from a nail like decoration, placed the faceless doll carefully on a makeshift shelf. Molly found wildflowers growing near the creek and brought them back in a rusted can filled with water. Not decoration, survival, beauty in the smallest acts of defiance. Jessa organized their scattered possessions into something that looked like order. Clothes folded, boots paired and lined up. The few books and papers Mara had been using to teach them reading stacked neat on the table. Rue and Tamsin wove prairie grass into rough mats that would cover the dirt floor, give them something soft to walk on. Nell taught Ivy a new song, and they sang it quietly while they worked, something about rivers and mountains and finding your way home. Elias appeared sometime after midnight with a small iron stove. Not new, dented and patched, but cleaned and functional. He said nothing, just helped them position it in the corner where smoke could vent through a gap they'd left in the roof, showed Mara how to build a fire that would burn clean, then disappeared back into the darkness. By dawn, their rough structure had become something else. Something that breathed life instead of just providing shelter. You could walk in and see 6 girls who lived here, who had spaces they'd claimed and things they'd arranged with care. You could see evidence of learning, the papers, the charcoal-scrawled letters, evidence of care, the mended clothes, the braided hair, the wildflowers in the rusted can. Evidence of home. They were exhausted beyond measure, running on nothing but will and the knowledge that this might be their last night together. But when Mara looked at what they'd created, she felt something fierce and proud unfurl in her chest. "Whatever happens," she told them as the sky began to lighten, "you did this. You built this. Nobody can take that from you, even if they take everything else." The girls gathered close, pressed together in the center of their home, holding on to each other like anchors in a storm. Outside, the sun climbed higher. 8 o'clock was coming, bringing with it a wagon and official authority and the end of everything they'd fought for. But for now, for these last quiet moments, they were together. They were home. And that was worth every blister, every bent nail, every desperate hour they'd poured into these walls. When the wagon finally arrived, right on time, drawn by 2 horses and carrying 3 men including Walter Finch and a sheriff Mara didn't recognize, they were ready. The girls stood in a line in front of their home, hands linked, wearing their cleanest clothes and their most determined expressions. Mara stood with them, one hand on Ivy's shoulder, the other holding Jess's, creating a human chain that said without words, "You'll have to break us apart because we won't separate willingly." Finch climbed down from the wagon, legal papers in hand, and stopped when he saw what they'd built. His expression flickered, surprise maybe, or reluctant respect. He'd seen the shed 4 days ago. Now he was looking at a structure with walls and a roof and a door that locked, at wildflowers in a rusted can, at 6 girls standing together like they belonged. "Mrs. Quinn," he said quietly, "please don't make this harder than it needs to be." "This is exactly as hard as it needs to be," Mara replied. "Come inside first. See what you're taking them from before you take them." Finch hesitated, legal papers rustling in the morning breeze. The sheriff stepped forward, hand resting on his belt in that casual way lawmen did when they wanted you to remember they had authority. But Mara didn't move, didn't flinch, just stood there with 6 girls linked to her like a chain that would take force to break. "Mrs. Quinn, I have a court order." "I know what you have," Mara interrupted. "I'm asking you to see what we have before you execute it. 5 minutes, that's all." Finch exchanged glances with the sheriff, some silent communication passing between them. Finally, he nodded. 5 minutes. Mara led them inside, the girls parting to let the men enter their home. It was small in the morning light, smaller than it had seemed in darkness, but it was undeniably real. The swept floor, the table with its neat stack of learning materials, the sleeping spaces arranged with care, the small iron stove still radiating warmth from the fire they'd kept burning all night, the wildflowers catching sunlight in their rusted can. Finch walked slowly through the space, taking it in. He picked up one of the papers from the table, Nell's attempt at writing her name, letters shaky but determined, set it down carefully, looked at the mended clothes hanging from nails, the paired boots, the faceless doll sitting on its shelf like a guardian spirit. "You built this in 4 days," he said quietly. "We built it in 4 days because we had to," Mara replied. "Because you gave us a deadline, and we met it. Because these girls deserve walls and a roof and a place that's theirs." The sheriff was studying the walls, testing them with his hand. "It's solid work, rough, but solid." "It's home," Molly said suddenly, her gap-toothed voice clear and defiant. "It's the first real home some of us ever had." Finch turned to look at her. "You're Molly?" She nodded. "And you want to stay here? In this?" He gestured at the rough walls, the dirt floor, the obvious poverty of their circumstances. "Yes." No hesitation. "I want to stay with Mara and my sisters. This is where we belong." You don't have adequate food. You don't have winter provisions. We have each other, Jessa cut in, stepping forward. We have someone who doesn't hit us for crying or lock us in closets or tell us we're worthless. We have someone who taught us to read and braided our hair and built this place with us, not for us. That's more than the county home ever gave anyone. Finch's jaw tightened. The county facilities provide structure, education, 3 meals a day. And fear, Tamsin said, her voice trembling but determined. And loneliness, and the kind of lessons you learn when adults with power decide you're not worth treating like a human being. That's not... Finch stopped, looking genuinely troubled. That's not supposed to happen. But it does, Rue said. Everyone knows it does. You know it does. You're just paid to pretend the institutions work because it's easier than fixing them. The silence stretched heavy and uncomfortable. Mara watched Finch's face, saw him struggling with something, conscience maybe, or just the cognitive dissonance of holding court orders in one hand while standing in a home built by children and a widow the law had already dismissed. The sheriff cleared his throat. These girls seem well cared for, Walter. Educated, clean, not what I'd call neglected. The living conditions are still inadequate, Finch said, but his voice had lost some of its certainty. The law is clear about minimum standards. The law is clear about a lot of things, Mara interrupted. But it's rarely clear about what happens to children once they're removed from inadequate situations. You'll take them today, put them in a wagon, deliver them to a facility in Cheyenne. Then what? You file your report and move on to the next case. But those girls, they'll spend months or years in a system that treats them like inventory. And you know it. I'm following the law, Mrs. Quinn. I don't have a choice. Everyone has a choice. Mara's voice went hard. You can choose to see 6 children who are loved and safe and learning, or you can choose to see paperwork that makes your job easier. You can choose to give us time to improve this place, or you can choose to rip them away right now because a court order says you can. Finch looked down at the papers in his hand, then at the girls watching him with desperate hope barely contained. Time won't change the fundamental issues. You still have no legal guardianship, no income, no... Then help me get those things. Mara heard the desperation creeping into her voice and didn't care. Tell me what I need to do to make this legal. Tell me what hoops to jump through, what forms to file, what boxes to check. I'll do it. Whatever it takes. It's not that simple. Why not? The question came from Elias Crow, who'd appeared in the doorway without anyone noticing. He stood there in his leather apron, arms crossed, expression set in that granite way he had when he'd decided something. Seems pretty simple to me. Woman wants to care for children. Children want to be cared for. Why's the law making it complicated? Finch turned. Mr. Crow, this doesn't concern... It concerns me when it's happening on my property, Elias said evenly. This shed? This land? It's mine, and I'm giving Mrs. Quinn permission to build here. Written permission if you need it. That address one of your concerns? That's... Finch consulted his papers. That's one issue, yes, but there's still the matter of legal guardianship, of resources. She's got resources, Elias continued. I'm employing her. Washing, mending, cooking, whatever work she's capable of, paying wage. That address your income concern? Mara stared at him. Elias, you don't have to. Wasn't asking permission, he said, not looking at her. Was stating fact. You do work. I pay you. Been happening already, just making it official now. The sheriff was watching this exchange with something that might have been approval. Sounds like Mrs. Quinn's addressing the concerns in your report, Walter. Might be worth giving her time to formalize the arrangements. The court order is already issued, Finch said, but his conviction was cracking. I can't just ignore it because you can file an amended report. The sheriff's voice carried quiet authority. You can tell the magistrate that circumstances have changed since your initial assessment, that the living situation has improved and legal arrangements are being formalized. Ask for a delay while you conduct a follow-up evaluation. And if the magistrate denies it, then you execute the order, but at least you gave it an honest assessment instead of just following paperwork. The sheriff looked at the girls, at their linked hands and determined faces. These children don't look abused or neglected to me. They look scared of being taken away from someone they trust. That ought to count for something. Finch stood very still, papers trembling slightly in his grip. Mara could see the war happening behind his eyes. Duty versus conscience, procedure versus humanity. She held her breath, felt the girls do the same, 6 small bodies going rigid with hope they were afraid to feel. I need to inspect the property more thoroughly, Finch said finally. Document the improvements. Interview each child individually to ensure they're not being coerced. They're not being coerced, Mara said. Then the interviews will confirm that. He looked at her directly. And I'll need written documentation from Mr. Crow regarding employment and property use. Detailed documentation, not just verbal agreement. You'll have it, Elias said, and you'll need to begin formal guardianship proceedings. File the paperwork, go through proper channels. This can't stay informal indefinitely. I'll file whatever you need, Mara promised. Just tell me what and where. Finch took a long breath, then folded his papers with deliberate care. I'm going to recommend a 60-day delay to the magistrate. That gives you time to formalize your situation and me time to conduct proper follow-up. But Mrs. Quinn, his voice went stern. If conditions worsen, if those girls show any signs of neglect or harm, if you fail to follow through on these commitments, I will be back with that wagon and I won't hesitate. Do you understand? I understand. Mara's voice was shaking. Thank you. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. The magistrate might reject my recommendation and order immediate removal anyway. But I'll make the case for delay. He looked at the girls. You want to stay here? 6 heads nodded in perfect unison. Then you help Mrs. Quinn make this work. You keep learning, keep growing, keep being the kind of children who prove the system wrong about what's possible. He tucked the papers back into his satchel. I'll be back in 2 weeks to check progress. Make sure I see improvement. He left with the sheriff, their footsteps crunching across the hard-packed ground toward the wagon. The girls didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't dare believe it was real until the wagon had turned around and started rolling back toward town, dust rising in its wake. Then Molly let out a sound somewhere between a sob and a laugh and threw her arms around Mara's waist. The other girls followed, piling on until Mara was buried in small bodies and tears and relief so intense it felt like pain. We're staying? Ivy whispered against Mara's chest. Really staying? For now, Mara managed. For 60 days at least, maybe longer if we do this right. We'll do it right, Jessa said fiercely. We'll do whatever it takes. Elias was still standing in the doorway, watching them with an expression Mara couldn't quite read. She extracted herself from the pile of girls and crossed to him. You didn't have to do that, she said quietly. Offer employment. Give me permission for the land. You put yourself at risk. Wasn't risk, Elias said. Was truth. You do work. I should pay you for it. And this land's not doing anything useful sitting empty. Might as well have something good on it. Elias, stop thanking me. His voice was gruff, but not unkind. Makes me uncomfortable. Just do the work and keep those girls safe and we'll call it even. He turned to leave, but Mara caught his arm. Why? Why risk your reputation? You're standing in this town, for us. Elias looked at her hand on his arm, then at her face. For a moment his expression softened into something raw and honest. Because Catherine would have, he said quietly. My wife. She'd have fought for those girls the same way you're fighting. Would have built them a home and told the whole town to go to hell if they tried to stop her. And I didn't fight hard enough for her when she needed it. His throat worked. Maybe this is me trying to do better, make different choices. Mara understood grief like that, the kind that burrowed into your bones and made you search for redemption in every subsequent decision. She'd be proud of you, she said. Don't know about that, but I know I can live with myself easier helping you than I could live with watching them take those girls. He pulled his arm free gently. Now, let me get that documentation written before Finch changes his mind. He disappeared into his shop, leaving Mara standing in her doorway with 6 girls and 60 days to transform their rough shelter into something the law couldn't dismiss. The work began immediately. They had 2 months to prove they were more than a temporary solution, more than a desperate woman and orphaned children playing house in salvaged lumber. They had to become legitimate, legal, undeniable. Mara started with the guardianship paperwork. Elias helped her compose a letter to the territorial court explaining her situation and requesting formal proceedings. The language felt strange in her mouth as she dictated it: petitioner and minor children and suitable accommodation. Legal words for human things like love and belonging, and the simple fact that these girls needed her and she needed them. They posted the letter with money Elias loaned her against future wages, then waited for response with the particular anxiety of people who'd learned that bureaucracy moves slow, but consequences moved fast. While they waited, they improved the house. Elias showed them how to mix proper mortar from clay and lime, how to chink the gaps in the walls so winter wind wouldn't cut through. They built a proper chimney for the stove using stones hauled from the creek bed, mortared together with patient hands and determination. Added a second room using more salvaged lumber, smaller, barely large enough for 2 sleeping pallets, but separate space that meant privacy and dignity. Mara sewed curtains from flour sacks boiled clean and dyed with pokeweed berries until they turned a faded purple red. Hung them over the window gaps to create the illusion of glass, the possibility of privacy. The girls helped paint the door with whitewash Elias mixed from lime and water, transforming rough lumber into something that looked intentional. They built a table that didn't wobble, benches that could hold weight without creaking, shelves for the few books they'd accumulated through scavenging and trade. Every improvement made the space more real, more defensible against criticism. But the bigger challenge was income. Elias's employment offer was real, but Mara needed more than washing and mending to prove financial stability. She started taking in more work, anything people would pay for. She washed clothes at the creek until her hands were raw, hung them to dry on lines stretched between cottonwoods, mended tiers and replaced buttons, working by candlelight when the girls were asleep, fingers moving through fabric with automatic precision born of desperation. The girls helped however they could. Jessa and Molly gathered kindling and sold it for pennies to households too lazy to collect their own. Rue and Tamsin picked wild berries and sold them to the baker's wife, who paid poorly but paid cash. Nell learned to make soap from ashes and lard, harsh stuff that stripped skin but got things clean. Even Ivy contributed, collecting prairie grass that Mara wove into small mats she sold for a few cents each. It was grinding work, the kind that wore you down to bone and will. But every penny brought them closer to the kind of financial stability that might convince a judge they were viable. 2 weeks after Finch's first visit, he returned as promised. The girls had been watching for him, taking turns at the window gap, and when his gray horse appeared, they scrambled into formation, standing in a line, hands clean, hair braided, wearing their mended clothes like armor. Finch dismounted slowly, taking in the changes with an expression that might have been surprised approval. The chimney, the painted door, the curtains. The small vegetable garden Mara had started behind the house using seeds traded from a farmer's wife. "Mrs. Quinn," he said, "I see you've been busy. You said show improvement. We're showing improvement." He walked the perimeter of the property, examining everything with that clinical eye she'd come to expect. Checked the mortar in the walls, tested the sturdiness of the chimney, looked inside at the organized space, and the evidence of learning still spread across the table. Then he interviewed the girls one by one, taking them aside separately to ask questions Mara couldn't hear. She watched through the window gap, heart hammering, as Finch talked to each child with careful attention. Watched Molly gesture emphatically, Jessa answer with careful precision, Ivy whisper something while clutching her faceless doll. When he was done, he called Mara outside. "They're well-spoken," he said. "Articulate, better educated than I expected given the circumstances. I teach them every day." "So they said. Multiple times, in fact, with considerable enthusiasm." He consulted his notebook. "They also said you haven't missed a single lesson, that you make sure they eat before you do, that you've been teaching them not just letters, but arithmetic, geography, practical skills. They deserve education, and they're getting it. More than many children in traditional homes, frankly." He closed the notebook. "I've documented the improvements. The magistrate will need to see them personally before making a final determination on your guardianship petition, but my recommendation will be favorable." Mara felt her knees go weak. "Favorable?" "Conditional," Finch clarified. "You're still operating on limited resources. The living situation, while improved, is still modest, but the children are clearly thriving under your care, and Mr. Crow's employment arrangement provides some financial stability. He paused. There's also the matter of public opinion. What about it? It's shifting, slowly but noticeably. Mrs. Bartlett spoke to the magistrate personally about what she witnessed here, said she'd testify if needed about the quality of care she observed. And apparently several other women have been asking questions about the county home system, demanding accountability. He smiled faintly. You've made people uncomfortable, Mrs. Quinn, made them look at things they'd rather ignore. That works in your favor.
When will the magistrate visit? Within the month. Prepare as if you're hosting the most important guest of your life, because in many ways, you are. He mounted his horse. And Mrs. Quinn, whatever you're doing, keep doing it. Those girls are proof that sometimes the unconventional solution is the right one. He rode away, leaving Mara standing in her doorway with hope that felt almost dangerous to hold. That night they celebrated with a stew made from vegetables Elias had quietly left on their doorstep, and a rabbit Jessa had snared using skills Mara probably shouldn't have asked about. It wasn't much, but they ate until they were full for the first time in weeks, and afterward they sang songs and told stories, and acted like a family that believed in its own future. The magistrate's visit came 3 weeks later, announced by a formal letter delivered by a boy on a mule who was paid to forget what he'd seen.
Mara had 5 days to prepare, 5 days to transform their home into something that would withstand official scrutiny and personal judgment. They cleaned until their hands bled, swept the floor so smooth it almost shone, scrubbed the walls, polished the few metal implements they owned, arranged their sleeping spaces with military precision. Mara sewed a new dress for herself using fabric Elias had traded from a merchant passing through. Not fine, just clean and whole, without patches or obvious wear. She braided the girl's hair with extra care, using ribbons Helen Bartlett had sent with a note that said simply, "For the magistrate. Show him what home looks like." The magistrate arrived in a carriage pulled by matched bay horses, wearing a suit that cost more than Mara had earned in 6 months, and carrying himself with the unconscious authority of someone who'd never had to question his right to judge others. His name was Edgar Whitmore, and he looked exactly like what Mara expected, older, prosperous, with the kind of face that had forgotten what struggling felt like. But when he stepped down from his carriage and saw the house, saw the garden, saw 6 girls standing in formation with their braided hair and clean faces and defiant dignity, something flickered across his expression that might have been respect. "Mrs. Quinn," he said, "I'm here to evaluate your petition for guardianship." "We're ready," Mara replied. She led him through the house, explaining every improvement, every detail, every choice they'd made with limited resources and unlimited determination. Showed him the learning materials, the evidence of education, the pantry where they stored what little food they had, the sleeping spaces arranged to give each girl her own small territory. Whitmore asked questions, not hostile, but probing, about income, about winter provisions, about discipline and structure, and how Mara planned to manage 6 children through adolescence and into adulthood. Mara answered honestly. They were still poor, still struggling, still operating on the edge of viability, but they were together, and they were trying, and that had to count for something. Then Whitmore interviewed the girls. Unlike Finch, he did it in the main room where Mara could hear, perhaps recognizing that secrets would only undermine trust. "Do you feel safe here?" he asked Molly. "Yes, sir." "Are you fed adequately?" "We eat every day. Sometimes it's not much, but it's something, and Mara always makes sure we eat first." To Jessa, "Are you receiving education?" "Yes, sir. Reading, writing, arithmetic, geography, some history, practical skills like sewing and cooking and how to straighten nails." She said it with pride, like nail straightening was an accomplishment worth noting. To Tamsin, "Do you wish to remain here?" "More than anything, sir." "Why?" Tamsin thought carefully before answering. "Because this is the first place anyone ever treated me like I mattered more than I cost." Whitmore wrote that down in his leather-bound notebook, pen scratching across expensive paper. When he finished with the interviews, he asked to speak with Mara privately. They stepped outside, leaving the girls pressed against the window gap trying to hear. "You understand," Whitmore said quietly, "that what you're attempting is highly irregular. Single women don't typically assume guardianship of multiple unrelated children.
The legal precedent is minimal. The social pressure will be considerable. I know. And you're prepared to face that? To have people question your fitness, your motives, your moral character on a daily basis? They've been doing that since my first husband died, Mara said. I'm used to it. Whitmore studied her with shrewd eyes. Mr. Finch speaks highly of your dedication, Mrs.
Bartlett was quite passionate in her testimony. Mr. Crow's written statement was surprisingly detailed for a man known for his silence. He paused. But endorsements aren't enough. The question is whether this arrangement serves the children's best interests. And what do you think? Mara asked. After everything you've seen today, after talking to them, do you think they'd be better off in an institution? What I think, Whitmore said slowly, is that the law is designed to protect children, not to destroy families that function despite not fitting conventional molds. He pulled a document from his jacket. This is a provisional guardianship order. It grants you temporary legal custody for 1 year, after which we'll conduct another evaluation. Mara's vision blurred. You're granting it. Conditionally, you'll need to maintain adequate living standards, continue their education, report quarterly on their welfare, and, he fixed her with a stern look, you'll need to demonstrate continued financial stability. Mr. Crow's employment is a good start, but it's not enough to support 7 people long term. I'll find more work. I'll do whatever. I know you will, Mrs. Quinn. Your determination is evident. He handed her the document. But understand that this is a probationary arrangement. One significant failure, and I'll have no choice but to remove the children for their own protection. There won't be failures, Mara said fiercely. I won't let there be. Then congratulations. You're officially their guardian. He climbed back into his carriage, then paused. For what it's worth, Mrs. Quinn, I hope you succeed. Those girls clearly love you, and that's worth more than most people realize. The carriage rolled away, leaving Mara standing in the summer heat with a legal document clutched in her shaking hands, and 6 girls exploding through the door behind her, screaming questions and hope and barely contained joy. What did he say? Jessa demanded. Are we staying? Mara turned to face them, tears streaming down her face, and held up the document. You're staying. We're official. For 1 year at least, you're mine and I'm yours, and nobody can take that away. They hit her like a small hurricane, all 6 at once, arms and tears and laughter mixing together until Mara couldn't tell where she ended and they began. They collapsed in a pile on the ground outside their home, holding onto each other like anchors, like proof, like the family they'd fought so hard to become. Elias appeared in his shop doorway, watching them with an expression that was almost soft. Mara met his eyes across the distance and mouthed, "Thank you." He nodded once, then disappeared back into his forge, where fire glowed and metal waited to be shaped into something useful. That night they had a feast. Nothing fancy, beans and cornbread and the last of the berries they'd been hoarding, but it felt like a celebration worthy of the moment. They ate until they were too full to move, then lay on their sleeping pallets, watching candlelight flicker across the ceiling they'd built with their own hands. We did it, Nell whispered. We actually did it. We did, Mara agreed. But it's not over. We have a year to prove this works, a year to make ourselves so undeniable they can't ever question it again. Then we'll do that too, Molly said with fierce certainty. We've come this far. We can go farther. Ivy crawled into Mara's arms, faceless doll pressed between them. Are you really our mama now? She asked. For real? Mara's throat closed. For real, sweetheart, legally and officially, and in every way that matters. Good, Ivy said, and fell asleep there, trusting and safe. The other girls drifted off one by one, exhaustion finally claiming them after weeks of fear and work and desperate hope. Mara lay awake listening to them breathe, feeling the weight of 6 children depending on her, trusting her, believing she could do this impossible thing. She thought about the months ahead, about winter coming and provisions needed and quarterly reports to file. About the constant scrutiny and judgment and the knowledge that one mistake could destroy everything. About how hard it would be and how little margin for error they had. But she also thought about how far they'd come. From a bench outside a shuttered mercantile to a home built from salvaged lumber and bent nails and sheer refusal to accept what the world had decided was possible. From 7 separate people surviving alone to a family that had fought for each other and won. Outside, the summer night was finally cooling. Cicadas sang. Somewhere a coyote called. The world kept turning, indifferent to small victories and hard-won homes. But inside these rough walls, 7 people slept safe and together. And tomorrow they'd wake up and keep fighting, keep building, keep proving that love and stubbornness could be enough when everything else failed. Mara closed her eyes and let herself believe, just for tonight, that they were going to make it. Morning came with the kind of light that made promises feel possible. Mara woke to find all 6 girls already awake, sitting in a circle on the floor with the guardianship document spread between them like a treasure map. They were taking turns touching it, tracing the official seal with careful fingers, whispering the words they could read and asking about the ones they couldn't. "It says legal custody," Jessa was explaining to Ivy. "That means we're hers for real now, not just living here, actually hers." Ivy looked up when she heard Mara stir. "Good morning, Mama." The word hit Mara square in the chest. Mama. Not Mrs. Quinn or Ma'am, or just Mara. Mama, said with the kind of certainty that came from finally believing you belonged somewhere. "Good morning, sweetheart," Mara managed, her voice rough with emotion. They ate breakfast together, thin oatmeal sweetened with a spoonful of honey Elias had left without explanation, and then Mara gathered them around the table for what she'd been thinking about all night. "We have 1 year," she said, 1 year to prove this works so well they can't ever question it again. That means we need to do more than just survive. We need to thrive. We need to show them a family that's stronger together than any of us could be apart. "How do we do that?" Molly asked. Mara had been asking herself the same question since Whitmore's carriage rolled away. They had shelter now, and legal standing, but those were just foundations. They needed to build something that would last through seasons and scrutiny and whatever challenges the territory could throw at them. "We work," Mara said. "All of us, together. We make this place not just a home, but something the whole town can see as valuable. We show them that what we built matters." Over the next weeks, they transformed their small piece of ground into something that caught attention. The vegetable garden expanded, rows of beans and squash and carrots tended with the kind of care usually reserved for much finer things. Mara taught the girls to weed and water and watch for pests, turning cultivation into both survival and education. They built a chicken coop from scrap lumber, then traded mending work for 3 laying hens that Rue named and talked to like pets. The eggs became currency, sold to neighbors, traded for supplies, proof that they were producing value instead of just consuming resources. Elias showed them how to build a root cellar, digging into the earth behind the house to create cool storage for the vegetables they'd need to last through winter. The work was brutal, backs aching and hands blistered. But when they finished, they had a space that would keep food fresh when the snow came and the garden died. Mara took in more washing, more mending, anything that brought money. Her hands were raw constantly now, skin cracked from lye soap and cold water, but every coin went into a jar she kept hidden under a floorboard. Winter fund, she called it. Insurance against the quarterly report that would ask about financial stability. The girls contributed however they could. Jessa started teaching reading to younger children in town. Parents paid a few pennies for the lessons, grateful to have their kids occupied and learning. Molly and Tamsin collected herbs and wildflowers, drying them in bundles that Mara sold as sachets and seasonings. Nell's soap-making improved until she was producing bars that actually smelled pleasant, lavender-scented from plants she grew specifically for the purpose. Even Ivy helped, though she was still so small. She collected eggs from the hens, fed the chickens, swept the floor with a broom nearly as tall as she was. Her faceless doll went everywhere with her, a constant companion that Mara had learned not to question. But the real transformation came from something Mara hadn't expected: community. It started with Helen Bartlett, who arrived one morning with her wagon full of preserving jars and a proposition. "I've got more vegetables than I can process alone," she said without preamble. "You've got hands and time. We split the preserved goods 50-50, and both our families eat better this winter." They worked together for 3 days, boiling and sealing and storing until they had rows of jars filled with pickled vegetables, fruit preserves, tomato sauce. Helen taught them techniques Mara had never learned, tricks for making food last and taste good months after harvest. When they finished, Helen looked at the girls with their stained hands and tired faces and said, "You're raising them right, Mara, teaching them to work and contribute. That's worth more than people realize." Word spread. Other women started appearing, tentatively at first, then with more confidence. A farm wife who needed help with harvest in exchange for a share of the grain. A widow who wanted company while she quilted and was willing to teach the skill and trade for conversation. A merchant's wife who had fabric scraps she didn't want wasted and wouldn't mind if someone with clever hands turned them into something useful. Not everyone. Baker Morrison still crossed the street to avoid them. The preacher still gave sermons about proper families and moral instruction that were clearly aimed at Mara's irregular household. But enough people warmed to them that Mara stopped feeling like the town's collective shame and started feeling like someone who belonged, even if that belonging came with conditions. The girls flourished. Jessa grew taller, more confident, started talking about maybe becoming a teacher herself someday. Molly lost another tooth but gained a smile that could light up rooms. Rue stopped flinching at loud noises. Tamsin sang while she worked. Nell built things constantly, small wooden toys, a shelf for the kitchen, a step stool so Ivy could reach the table. And Ivy started talking more, her quiet voice joining the household chorus with increasing frequency. But the greatest change was in Mara herself. She'd spent 2 years after Jacob's death feeling like a ghost haunting her own life, waiting for someone to finally notice she was there and tell her to leave. Now she woke up every morning with purpose pressed against her like those 6 warm bodies in their sleeping spaces. She had work to do, children to feed, a family to protect. It turned out that being needed was the opposite of being cursed. It was being anchored to the world in a way that made surviving feel like living again. 3 months into their provisional guardianship, Elias asked her to stay after she'd finished the day's washing. "Got something to discuss," he said, uncomfortable in that way he got when words required more than his usual silence. Mara followed him into his shop, where the forge glowed orange and waiting. He'd been working on something. She could see it on the table, covered with a cloth. "You've been here 4 months now," Elias said. "You and the girls. Working, building, making this place better just by being in it." "You've been incredibly generous," Mara replied. "The employment, the use of the land, not generosity, just sense." He pulled the cloth away from the table. Underneath was a sign, hand-carved from smooth pine, letters burned into the wood with careful precision. Crow and Quinn. Washing, mending, general labor. Mara stared at it. "I don't understand." "Making it official," Elias said. "You're not just doing me favors or working for scraps. You're my business partner. We split the proceeds from the work you bring in. You get a real income, something you can show the magistrate when he asks about financial stability." "Elias, that's too much. It's practical." He picked up the sign, testing its weight. "You bring in customers I'd never get otherwise. Women who want washing and mending done by someone who knows fabric. Families who need help with work I'm too busy to handle. You're making this shop more profitable just by being here. So we make it official, and you get the security you need." Mara's eyes stung. "Why do you keep doing this? Helping us?" Elias was quiet for a long moment, staring at the sign in his hands. "Catherine and I tried for years to have children," he said finally. "Lost 3 before they could draw breath. The 4th killed her along with itself. I spent months after wondering what I'd done wrong, what I could have done different." He set the sign down carefully. "Then you show up with 6 girls who needed someone and you choose them anyway, even though it's hard and dangerous and everyone tells you you're wrong. You build them a home with your bare hands. You fight the whole damn system to keep them." He looked at her directly, winter sky eyes steady. "That's what Catherine would have done. What we would have done together if we'd had the chance. Helping you means something she cared about still matters. Means her wanting to be a mother, all those years of trying. It wasn't meaningless just because she didn't survive it." Mara stepped forward and did something she'd never done before. Hugged Elias Crow, the silent, grieving man who'd been helping them survive without asking for anything in return. He went rigid at first, unused to touch. Then slowly his arms came up and he held on like he'd forgotten what it felt like to be held. "She'd be so proud of you," Mara whispered. And I'm grateful for everything. They stood there for a moment, two people who'd lost everything finding something like family in the ruins. Then Elias cleared his throat and stepped back, returning to the comfortable distance he maintained with the world. "We'll hang the sign tomorrow," he said. "Start advertising the partnership. Should bring in more work before winter hits." The sign went up the next morning, visible from the street, declaring to all of Dry Ridge that Mara Quinn wasn't just surviving on charity. She was building something with substance and legitimacy. The work increased almost immediately. Women who'd been hesitant to associate with the cursed widow were more willing to do business with an established shop. Money came in steadier, enough that Mara could buy proper winter coats for the girls instead of trying to patch together something from scraps. But success brought new attention, and not all of it welcome. Baker Morrison appeared at their door one evening, his thick-necked son Thomas standing behind him with that same cruel smirk he'd worn when he called them strays. Mara met them outside, keeping her body between them and the house where the girls were having dinner. "Morrison," she said evenly, "what do you want?" "Heard about your business arrangement with Crow," Morrison said. "Interesting how you managed to land on your feet no matter how many men fall around you." Mara's jaw tightened. "If you've got an accusation to make it. Otherwise, leave my property." "Your property?" Morrison's laugh was ugly. "You're renting space from a grief-addled blacksmith and pretending you've built something permanent. But we both know what you really are, Quinn. You're a woman who survives by latching onto whoever's convenient. First two husbands, now Crow, probably teaching those girls the same tricks." He didn't get to finish. Elias appeared from his shop, hammer still in hand, expression darker than Mara had ever seen it. "You want to repeat that, Morrison?" His voice was quiet, but carried the kind of threat that made smart men step back. Morrison paled slightly, but held his ground. "Just speaking truth. That woman's got a history." "That woman," Elias interrupted, "works harder than any 3 people in this town. She's raising 6 children nobody else wanted, building a business, contributing to the community. What exactly have you done lately besides spread poison and raise a son who throws rocks at orphans?" Thomas stepped forward, fists clenched. "You can't talk to my father like—" "I can and will," Elias said flatly. "Now get off this property before I decide your father needs to learn about respect the way his son needs to learn about decency." Morrison grabbed Thomas's arm, pulling him back. "The magistrate's going to hear about this arrangement, about you giving property and employment to a woman with your wife barely cold in the ground. People will talk." "Let them talk," Elias said. "I stopped caring what this town thought when you all decided my grief was an inconvenience. Now leave." They left, Morrison's anger visible in every stiff step. Mara watched them go, then turned to Elias. "He's going to make trouble," she said. "Tell the magistrate we're living in sin or something equally ridiculous. Claim the guardianship should be revoked because nothing," Elias interrupted. "Our arrangement is documented, legal, above reproach no matter how much he wants to make it sound dirty." He looked at her seriously. "But he's right about one thing. People will talk. They'll assume things about us that aren't true." "I know." Mara had been expecting this, honestly. A widow and a widower working together, living in close proximity, of course people would make assumptions. "Does it bother you?" Elias considered. "Does it bother you?" "Not really. I've already been called worse things." "Then we ignore it. Keep working, keep building. Show them that not every partnership between a man and woman has to be about what small minds assume it's about." He paused. "Unless—" He stopped, looking uncomfortable. "Unless what?" "Unless someday it's about something more than partnership." The words came out rough, like he wasn't used to saying things that mattered. "I'm not proposing, not asking for anything. Just acknowledging that you're a remarkable woman, and I'm a man who's been alone too long. And sometimes when I watch you with those girls, I remember what it felt like to want a family." Mara's breath caught. She looked at Elias Crow, weathered and grieving and fundamentally decent in a way this town didn't deserve, and saw a possibility there. Not immediate, not urgent, but real. "Someday," she said quietly, "maybe someday, we could be something more than business partners. But right now, I need to focus on keeping these girls safe and proving to the magistrate I can do this alone. Does that make sense?" Perfect sense. Elias looked relieved, like he'd expected rejection. I can wait. I'm good at waiting. Thank you, Mara said, for understanding, for everything. He nodded and returned to his forge, leaving Mara standing in the cooling evening air, thinking about futures she'd stopped believing in and second chances that arrived when you weren't looking. The first quarterly report came in October, when the leaves were turning and the air carried the first whisper of winter. Walter Finch arrived unannounced, as was apparently his habit, and spent 3 hours examining everything: the house, the business records, the girls' educational progress, their health and happiness, and general well-being. He interviewed each girl again, asked Mara detailed questions about finances and provisions and plans for winter, examined the root cellar full of preserved food, the chicken coop with its 3 productive hens, the firewood stacked high and ready, looked at Mara's partnership agreement with Elias, the documented income, the proof that they were solvent and stable. When he finished, he sat at their rough table and wrote his report while they waited, every scratch of his pen feeling like judgment being passed. Your progress is remarkable, he said finally, not looking up. In 3 months, you've gone from barely surviving to genuinely thriving. The children are healthy, educated, clearly well cared for. Your financial situation has stabilized significantly. He set down his pen. I'm recommending continuation of the guardianship without reservation. Mara felt her knees go weak. Without reservation? You've exceeded every expectation I had, Mrs. Quinn. You've proven that unconventional families can work when built on dedication and love. He stood, gathering his papers. The magistrate will conduct his evaluation in 9 months as scheduled, but barring catastrophe, I expect he'll make this arrangement permanent. After he left, Mara gathered the girls and told them the news. They celebrated with apple cake Nell had learned to make from Helen Bartlett, eating until their stomachs hurt and laughing until their ribs ached. That night, after the girls were asleep, Mara sat outside looking at the stars scattered across the October sky, like seeds someone had thrown with wild abandon. She thought about the woman she'd been 6 months ago, sitting on a bench outside a shuttered mercantile, waiting for the day to finish her, believing she was nothing but trouble the world would be better off without. That woman felt like a stranger now. This woman, the one with 6 daughters and a business partnership and a home built from salvaged lumber and bent nails, she was someone new. Someone who'd learned that being needed wasn't a burden, but a gift. That choosing to fight when everyone expected you to fold was its own kind of power. Winter came hard that year, the kind of cold that made your breath freeze in your lungs and turned the prairie into something hostile and alien. But they were ready. The root cellar kept their food fresh. The improved walls and chimney kept the house warm. The chicken coop, insulated with straw and careful planning, kept the hens laying sporadically through the cold months. They spent the long evenings together, crowded around the stove while Mara taught lessons, or Nell worked on her building projects, or Jessa read aloud from books they'd accumulated through trade and gift. Sometimes Elias joined them, sitting quietly in the corner doing small repair work, while the family filled his silence with noise and life. Morrison tried twice more to make trouble, once claiming to the sheriff that the girls were being neglected, which resulted in an unannounced inspection that found them healthy and well-fed and better educated than Morrison's own children. Once spreading rumors that Mara was running some kind of improper house, which resulted in several respectable women testifying loudly about the quality of her work and character. The rumors died when nobody would feed them. The town had watched this ragged family build themselves into something functional and real, and most people weren't willing to destroy that just to satisfy Morrison's spite. Spring came eventually, the way it always did, melting the snow and turning the prairie green again. They planted a bigger garden, bought 2 more chickens, started making plans for adding another room to the house. The girls grew, not just physically, but in confidence and skill, and the kind of security that came from believing your home would still be there tomorrow. In May, Magistrate Whitmore returned for his final evaluation. This time, there was no tension, no fear. They'd spent a year proving themselves. They had documentation, testimony, visible evidence of a family that worked. Whitmore spent the day with them, eating lunch at their table, watching the girls demonstrate their reading and arithmetic skills, walking through the expanded garden and improved house. He asked questions, but they felt more like curiosity than investigation. At the end of the day, he called Mara outside for a private conversation. Mrs. Quinn, he said, I've reviewed the quarterly reports. I've observed your household extensively, and I've come to a conclusion. Mara held her breath. What you've built here is remarkable, not just adequate or acceptable, but genuinely exemplary. Those girls are thriving in ways that frankly exceed most traditional households I evaluate. He pulled a document from his case. This is an order making your guardianship permanent. No more probation. No more quarterly reports unless you request assistance. Those girls are legally yours until they reach majority. Mara took the document with shaking hands. Permanent? Permanent, Whitmore confirmed. You've proven beyond any doubt that love and determination can create family, just as valid as blood. He paused. I'm also waiving the standard fees associated with this proceeding. Consider it recognition of exceptional circumstances and exceptional results. He left in his carriage, dust rising from the wheels, and Mara stood there holding legal permanence in her hands while 6 girls exploded from the house, screaming questions and joy. We're permanent, she shouted, and they collapsed together in a pile of arms and tears and laughter that felt like coming home after a journey she hadn't known she was taking. That evening, the whole scattered family gathered, Mara and the girls, Elias, Helen Bartlett and her son, a handful of other women who'd helped along the way. They ate together, celebrated together, bore witness to this small miracle that had happened despite every obstacle. Elias stood and raised a cup of cider. To Mara Quinn, he said, voice rough with emotion, who taught us all that family isn't about blood or convention or what people think is proper. It's about showing up, fighting, choosing each other even when it's hard. To Mara! The group chorused. Later, after everyone had left and the girls were asleep, Mara sat outside with Elias, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. You did it, he said quietly. You actually did it. We did it, Mara corrected. None of this works without you. You would have found another way. Maybe. But I'm glad I didn't have to. She looked at him, this silent man who'd been helping them survive since the beginning. Remember when you said maybe someday we could be something more than business partners? Elias went very still. I remember. I think maybe someday is closer than I thought. Mara took his hand, rough and calloused from forge work, warm and solid in hers. I'm not ready for marriage or anything formal, but I'm ready for possibility, for letting someone close again, for believing that second chances are real. Elias squeezed her hand gently. I can work with possibility. They sat in comfortable silence while night settled over Dry Ridge, and the house behind them breathed with the quiet sounds of sleeping children. Inside those walls built from salvaged lumber and bent nails and sheer refusal to give up, 7 people had found something most folks searched for their whole lives and never quite reached. They'd found home. Not the kind you're born into, but the kind you build with bleeding hands and desperate hope. The kind that stands through winter and judgment, and the particular cruelty of a world that didn't think you deserved to exist. They'd found family. Not perfect, not conventional, not what anyone would have chosen if they'd had better options, but real in the way things built under pressure become real, tested and proven and impossible to dismiss. And they'd found belonging. That rarest of gifts, the knowledge that you mattered to someone, and they mattered to you, and together you were something stronger than either could be alone. In the morning, Mara would wake to 6 girls who called her mama and needed breakfast and had lessons to learn and chores to do. She'd work alongside Elias in their partnership that was slowly becoming something deeper. She'd tend her garden and raise her chickens and continue proving to Dry Ridge that she deserved the space she occupied. But tonight, she let herself rest. Let herself feel the weight of permanent guardianship and the warmth of Elias's hand and the absolute bone-deep certainty that she'd done something impossible. She'd taken 6 forgotten girls and a woman the world had decided was cursed, and she'd built them into a family that would outlast every person who'd bet against them. The summer stars wheeled overhead, indifferent and eternal. The prairie stretched away into darkness, vast and empty and full of possibility. And in a small house behind a blacksmith shop, 7 people who'd been told they didn't belong had created belonging anyway. Sometimes that was enough. Sometimes that was everything. Mara closed her eyes and smiled, and for the first time in years felt completely at peace with exactly who she was and where she'd landed. Home, at last. Real and permanent and undeniable. A home that stayed.